Hey, Katie. We have the Whispering Statue. We are on chapter 15, An Abrupt Departure. Bess was in a panic. If we run inside, Mr. Basswood will see us. And if we don't, George replied, Nancy will be trapped. Bess added, if we don't show ourselves, but call out Debbie or Nancy, he'll be sure to hear it. By this time, Basswood had pulled into the driveway alongside the barn and parked in the rear. Nancy, having heard the automobile, appeared in the big doorway. Bess and George signaled to her frantically to come outside. The young detective hurried to her friends and asked, "What's up?" Quickly, George explained, and Bess said, "We'd better get away from here as soon as possible." "And lose the chance of obtaining a valuable bit of evidence?" Nancy asked. She turned to Bess. "Here are the car keys. Suppose you drive it around the bend out of sight. Then Mr. DeKeer will think we've left." As Bess scooted off, Nancy and George hid behind large terracotta statues and waited to see what would happen. In a moment, the two men came from the rear into the large showroom. "It was a catastrophe!" Mr. Basswood was storming. "They said it was a gas main explosion. Felt like an earthquake. I lost a lot of things and need some more statuettes." Suddenly his mood changed and he laughed. "I want real pieces, of course." Marco DeKeer laughed uproariously. "You've come to the right place, my friend. My originals are so original, nobody knows the difference." George whispered to Nancy, "The cheat! Let's go in there and confront the two of them with the truth." Nancy restrained George. "I'm afraid we'd just come out the losers." Just then Mr. DeKeer said, "A girl walked in here just a little while ago looking for an inexpensive reproduction. Said somebody in New York told her about me." Mr. Basswood looked apprehensive. "What did she look like?" Marco DeKeer described Debbie Lynbrook exactly. "Where is she now?" Mr. Basswood asked, alarm showing in his voice. "I suppose she drove off. Anyway, her car is gone." Basswood burst out, "I'm sure that's the girl who works for me. Her name is Debbie Lynbrook. I don't entirely trust her. Not that she would steal anything, but she's kind of nosy. I'd fire her, only she's an excellent saleswoman. As you know, Adkin is in the hospital. He'll be coming out pretty soon, though, and then I think I'll get rid of the girl." Nancy chuckled inwardly. Basswood did not call her Nancy Drew. He might think Debbie Lynbrook was a bit nosy, but at least he did not suspect that his employee was Nancy Drew, the young detective. George called softly, "Are you ready to leave? Those men may come outside at any moment." Nancy nodded. She most certainly did not want to be caught, and this was a good time to vanish. Dodging among statues, the two girls reached the roadway and hurried to where they were to meet Bess. "Thank goodness you're here," she said. "I was imagining all sorts of things about your becoming prisoners of those two men. What did you find out?" "A good bit," Nancy replied. "But I want to learn more. I noticed a restaurant in that house next to the barn. Why don't we have an early dinner there and watch the barn from the window?" "Food! Super!" Bess said. "I vote for that." She drove the car to the restaurant, turned into its driveway, and parked in the rear. There was a side entrance, so the three friends entered through the store. The first floor of the farmhouse had been converted into a charming, old-fashioned dining room. A pleasant-faced woman, who reminded Nancy of Hannah Gruen, showed them to a table next to a window. It overlooked a low hedge between the two properties. "We have no printed menus," the restaurant owner said. "Tonight we have homemade vegetable soup, baked ham or pot roast, sweet potatoes, and some of my home-canned peaches with chocolate cake for dessert. Maybe you noticed my orchards. The peaches grow right here." Bess sighed. "It must be heavenly living on a farm and raising all your own produce. Do you have chickens and cows and everything?" The woman, who said her name was Mrs. Ziegler, beamed. "Yes, everything." Nancy asked where she kept the livestock. "I see the barn near you is a sculptor's studio." Mrs. Ziegler said that the barn had not belonged to her farm. We keep our horses and cows and chickens across the road." Bess smiled at her and said, "Your baked ham dinner sounds marvelous. I'll have it, and you might add a glass of milk from one of your cows." Nancy and George decided to have the same dinner as Bess. When the soup was served, the three girls were looking out the window. Willis Basswood and Margot DeKeer were driving off together in the art dealer's car. "I wonder if they've left for the day," Bess spoke up. Mrs. Ziegler said, "I guess so. The sculptor doesn't stay around very long." She smiled. "He doesn't keep farmer's hours, which are very long hours." George asked the woman what kind of sculpture Mr. DeKeer was. "Famous?" Mrs. Ziegler shrugged. "Statuary isn't one of my interests, so I've never paid attention to the man. He's rather a man of mystery. Hardly anyone comes here except a trucker. I guess he brings supplies and carries away statues." Mrs. Ziegler walked off and did not return until the girls had finished the vegetable soup. In the meantime, they discussed the man next door. "So he's a man of mystery who makes ugly statues," George said. "We already know that," Bess remarked. "Nancy, how do you plan to find out more about this suspect?" The young detective's eyes sparkled. "As soon as we finish eating, I'm going back to Mr. DeKeer's place and do more investigating." "But surely," George said, "he must have locked the barn." "Oh, I wasn't going to trespass," Nancy told her. "We may find some clues on the ground around the barn." Half an hour later, the girls paid their checks and then strolled over to the Margot DeKeer place. Most of the statues were made of terracotta and were grotesque. Among them was a two-headed monster and a tall, skinny figure with an elongated head that rose to a peak and had slanted eyes and an upturned mouth. "That would give me a nightmare," Bess remarked. "Let's try tipping this one over to see if it has MDK on the bottom," Nancy suggested. The statue, though large, was not heavy, and the girls laid the figure on its side easily. Stuck to the bottom of it was part of a torn letter. "How did this get here?" Bess asked. "My guess is," said Nancy, "that pieces of a letter were thrown away, but the scrap must have missed the basket or been blown by the wind and plastered itself to the bottom of the statues." "What does it say?" George asked, walking around Nancy to read it. "Another puzzle," said Bess. "What does it mean?" The words on the jagged paper were, "Time to move. Competitors are suspicious. Stop work. Bull reproductions. Phone from pit. Soon as I look, whispering statues." They're all fragments. Quickly, Nancy took a notebook from her purse and copied the words in case she lost the original paper. "What a marvelous clue," she said. We'll have to find out why it's a marvelous clue.